Hello, Mrs. Day, and thank you so much for allowing me this opportunity to tell you a little bit about my years in theatre, and in particular how that relates to technical subjects like lighting and sound. I've got your questions here and I'll go through them, but as a way of introduction it's worth saying that unlike a lot of people that work backstage, I actually started by working on the stage and in school productions in fact, and every year since I was about 8 I'd audition for a part, be in the school production and absolutely loved it. But one year I was actually quite unwell and couldn't go to the auditions, and so decided I would actually work backstage that year. And thankfully it wasn't a very complicated production, having never worked on lighting before, but I decided that's what I would do that year, is to work on the lighting. And as they said, the rest is history, and I completely fell in love with the backstage work. And in fact, equally as much as I enjoy working on the stage, I enjoy working backstage. But let's have a look at your questions and see how they pertain to my experience of working on stage. So let's start off with lighting, because that's where I started, and I think it's fair to say that school productions are a wonderful introduction to theatre and working backstage or being on stage, and because you certainly start to, from the ground floor up, understand the basics and the principles, which will help you to grow and build from. So definitely worthwhile getting involved in school productions as soon as you can, if this is something you're interested in, and then from there going to work in amateur dramatics, for example go and volunteer at Sturts, and at very least go and pay for a guided tour around TRP in Plymouth, because that's an amazing hour or so of your life that you'll spend there, and it may just whet your appetite further. But to go to your questions, the roles and responsibilities as they pertain to a lighting technician, because that's where I started really, was within lighting on the technical side. And I say this applies to any role in theatre really, but number one priority, role and responsibilities, is safety. Safety of you, of the cast, the other technical members of the team, and of course the audience as well. So number one, always safety. Number two, servicing, testing and maintaining equipment is a big part of your role, and ensuring you've got sufficient spares, and in particular when it pertains to rechargeable batteries and things of that kind, because they can be a real bugbear. Repairing equipment, so you'll need to have a good basic understanding of how the equipment works and what it does and what its limits and capabilities are, but certainly how to repair it, and if you can't repair it, know where to send it to have it repaired by a professional. Next thing I guess is rigging and positioning lighting. And if you think about the last time you went to TRP, you see how tall the proscenium arch is, where you could be up as high as that, if not higher, actually rigging. In many cases the lighting comes down on a gantry to stage level, but it's not unusual if you have to go up to that kind of height, so you'd have to feel comfortable working at height as well. You'd also have to know how to program and operate a lighting desk, because unlike when I started, we had dimmers which, unlike the ones today which are sort of about this big on the lighting desk, when I started they were about 2 feet long, about 60 centimetres long, and you'd go from 0 down here somewhere, sliding all the way up to 60 centimetres to get 100% of lighting. So it was a very different world in those days, and if you had anything complicated lighting wise, you needed multiple pairs of hands to be able to push these great big faders up to get the lights up and down again. Beyond that, you'll need to be able to understand a script and the cues as it pertains to the lighting, because you'll be working closely with the lighting designer and setting up all the lighting and programming it into the desks. And of course one of the key things about working with the lighting designer is being sure you can deliver what they're looking for in terms of effect, and so that's very important. Second question, the sort of skills you'll need as a lighting technician. Well, I think one of the key skills you'll need to develop with any role in theatre, and I've mentioned it already, but it's kind of an offshoot, is you have to develop an eye for risk. And that is when you look at any given situation, you instinctively know when something doesn't look right, or something looks like it could be a hazard, a trip hazard, could be something that's sticking out that people could walk into, cabling. So you do have to develop a real kind of innate ability to identify when there's risk in a situation. You need to be a sort of a quietly confident sort of person. I think there's a lovely saying that goes, nobody likes a smart ass, if you'll pardon the language. And I think this is no further true than it is in the theatre world. Excuse me. You need to be confident, but you need to be quietly confident. You need to be able to put people at their ease so they feel you know what you're doing, but you need to go about that in a quiet way. Something that often isn't thought about when it comes to lighting is you need to have your vision checked to make sure that you have got absolute colour perception. Because although this might sound like an obvious thing to say, you've probably heard of green-blue blindness, and sometimes the difference between blue and green can be very, very fine. And unless your vision is absolutely colour 100%, then you won't be able to see the differences, and that can cause problems. I mentioned this earlier as well, but it's further to reinforce the message that you've got to be comfortable working at heights. You'd have to get a working at height certificate, you'd have to take a course and get a harness certificate, because that's going to be a big part of your life working in lighting. You'll need to be comfortable working by yourself, but in the theatre, just as anybody else, you're working as part of a big team, so you would need to be able to cooperate and work well with people, and so that's a key attribute you'll need to have. A good knowledge of electronics, especially as it pertains to the lighting side, but also electricity, and in particular loading, because a theatre, or if you're a touring company, anywhere you go will have a limit to the amount of electricity they can supply to the lighting desk. So you need to be able to calculate loads and work those things out as they pertain to the load you're going to put on the system. You'll need to be patient. You'll need to be a good communicator. You'll need to have real attention to detail, because that's absolutely what's required. During the course of a show, you'll spend many hours looking out at the stage, looking down at your desk, and just making sure that what you think is going to happen has actually happened. So being able to focus for long periods of time is a very important attribute for any technician in theatre. You need to be very well organised. You need to be very structured, and you also have to work well under pressure. And what I mean by that is, is that if something goes wrong in the theatre, something goes wrong with the lighting, you'll need to be able to think through what are your options to get that problem solved quickly, because, as they say, the show must go on. So who will you work with in lighting? Well, I've mentioned already, one of the key things is the lighting designer, and I think it's fair to say that when you start off, especially if you start in school productions, you're not only the technician, you're also the lighting designer, because the director of the show will look to you to create the atmosphere that they need for the show, so you'll be the lighting designer as well as the technician, and that's a role that when you move into professional theatre, whether that's touring or working in a venue, is that's something to aspire to, and it's a very, very big role. And there's one of my heroes in theatre is a lady called Jennifer Tipton, and she's one of the giants in theatre lighting. And she says 99% of the audience will be completely unaware of the lighting, but 100% of them will be involved and affected by it. So, you know, the lighting is such an important part of theatre, along with everything else, of course, So you'll work with the lighting designer. You'll work with the director as well, because if the lighting designer, once they've given you your brief and you're starting rehearsals, the director may look at a scene and think that's not quite what I thought it was going to be. So you'll need to cooperate closely with the director of the show as well. You'll also work with the stage manager, of course, because he's got responsibility for the working of the stage, and also you'll work with other technical crew as well. So maybe you'll have an assistant on the lighting desk, you'll work with other technical staff, and of course you'll work with the cast, very importantly. So quite a wide range of people that you'll work with is as a lighting technician. So let's look at sound. Roles and responsibilities for a sound technician. Well, as I mentioned last time, first and key principle, of course, for everybody is safety. So that's the first thing to consider as your role and responsibility. And similar as with sound, there'll be several things here that are familiar. For example, servicing, testing, maintaining the equipment. having spare parts available, repairing, doing simple repairs on equipment, and if you can't repair it, then know where to send it off to be repaired. There's also the matter of preparing sound desks and audio playback gear as well, so that's ready to be used in the production. Significantly, you'll interface far more closely with the cast in the sound role because you will be attaching their microphones and monitors, and typically in a theatre the microphone will be the type that's attached to the side of the face or in the hairline pointing down, and you may have seen those. Something I know you will have seen are the in-ear monitors that performers wear, and they're attached to a radio pack as well. And that allows the actor to be able to hear directions from sound cues from the director, and to be able to hear the orchestra as well if it's a musical. You'll also need to set up the wired microphones and mic stands. In the orchestra pit, for example, there could be 40 musicians, each of which will require a microphone and a stand. And of course, all of those cables have got to be safely routed, and the legs of the tripods have got to make sure that they're out of the way of people so we don't get any trip hazards around the orchestra pit. So when you consider that you could have up to 20 or maybe even more mics on the cast, you could be responsible for upwards of 60 microphones for a production, which takes quite a lot of looking after. You'll also need to run sound checks as well, of course, to make sure all those microphones are working as they should do. You'll need to make sure that the music that's needed for the production and the SFX that the director requires are available, cued and ready to play. You need to be able to use the script and the sound cues to create the effect that the director's looking for. And of course you'll need to maintain the sound levels, the relative mix between the microphones and the equalisation. And for example, one of the things you'll be doing during the course of a production is you'll be listening to make sure you can hear what you should be able to hear. And for example, that something isn't louder than it should be or too quiet. There could, for example, be, you might notice that the flutes are sounding a little bit too loud. So when you go to the channel, you might see that the LED ladder is hopping up towards the red. So something must have happened, the microphone must have been moved, or the flute player's got closer to the microphone. So you'll need to adjust that. The overall mix is important because if something is out of kilter, something's too loud or too quiet, then you won't hear the production the way it was intended. Equalisation is where we adjust the bass and the treble and all the frequencies between as well, because there are a lot, to make the sound natural and to meet the needs of the director. Speaking of which, before rehearsals, you'll attend meetings with key personnel like the director, the stage manager, the musicians, the conductor, to make sure that you have all of their requirements, and that's noted in the script alongside with the music cues and the SFX. When it comes to skills required, again there's some similarities here with lighting. And I guess one of the ones which, a bit like lighting, is not so obvious, but you would need to have your hearing checked, because you need to make sure that both your hearing is equal in both ears and that you can hear the full spectrum of audio. So from a very low frequency of around maybe down as low as 18 hertz up to about 25 kilohertz, that's the full sound spectrum, and you've got to be able to hear those equally in both ears. You'll need also to understand the capabilities, the correct usage and the limitations of the equipment you're working with. When's it appropriate to use a dynamic or a cardioid or a condenser mic? Will you need phantom power? So there are lots of different things that you'll need to understand, and when is it the right time to use what piece of kit for what job. You'll need a good working knowledge of electricity and electronics as well, just as in lighting, but more specifically as it's focused around sound. The same sort of personal traits are apply to all members of the team at a theatre. So good communication skills, attention to detail as I mentioned before, being patient, being able to focus for long periods of time, to listen for long periods of time and understand when something isn't right and know what you can do to put it right. Lastly, who will you be working with? Well, I've mentioned some of them earlier, but principally the director of the show will know what he's looking for in terms of how it's going to sound. The stage manager will have input as well to you. You'll have other theatre technical staff to work alongside, and as I've mentioned earlier, of course, the cast you'll work closely with, because you'll be actually equipping them for the production itself. So I hope that's been useful. That's a bit of a roundup of both the disciplines that I've certainly grown to love over the years and enjoy working in. If you've got any questions, please do feed them back through Mrs. Day, and I'll be delighted to speak to you again. Thank you.